Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into the content of this particular video, if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to support me in getting the word out there about the evidence-based approach of integrating the skills of dialectical behavior therapy and the understanding of personality that we get from schema therapy to effectively change those maladaptive behaviors that we use to deal with our underlying issues once and for all.
Yes!
In this conversation, we're going to explore something that I think is tied to almost every person I've ever worked with, which includes myself. In fact, I would say that anyone who uses addictive, obsessive and compulsive coping mechanisms to compensate for their underlying inability to handle emotional experiences has a significant problem with what we're going to talk about today. This particular extremely uncomfortable emotional experience is one that regularly has us spiraling into a place that we're desperately looking to escape from in whatever way we possibly can, and usually as fast as we possibly can too. In this video today, I want to talk about one of the hardest emotional experiences that we definitely need to learn to effectively deal with if we want to create those behavioral changes that we find so hard to actually make happen. So today, let's get into a conversation about the term toxic shame. Toxic shame is an expression that gets thrown around all the time in the meeting rooms of recovery and behaviour change programs. But before we can talk about the term toxic shame, I think it's really important to go over the emotion of shame itself so we can understand exactly what its purpose is within our personality system. Shame is something that every single program I've ever been involved with talks about to one degree or another. Early on in my own personal journey, I was heavily involved in the world of 12-step, and even though there's no official affiliation with external publications within that particular program, my support network of sponsors and mentors steered me towards the literature that was connected to processing shame from the very beginning. And when we look at things from a DBT perspective, shame is one of the 10 basic emotions that are a necessary and important part of the human experience. When we turn our attention to the continuum of feelings underneath the emotion of shame, we generally find things like embarrassment, humiliation, and self-consciousness. And all of the current evidence-based scientific research that I'm aware of tells us that every single emotional experience we have is something that human beings have developed over time for very specific reasons. In other words, our emotional experiences aren't just random things that are there to inconvenience us, they serve a purpose within our personality system. As I said before, we're taught in the DBT skills training program that there are 10 emotional experiences within our emotional system, each of which does a number of different things for us behaviorally. First, the emotion sends a signal to our brain that something needs to be addressed. Second, this emotional trigger then activates a behavioral response in the form of the actions we've learned to take. And third, the behavioral response sends out a signal to the world around us that we're having this emotional experience and basically something needs to be done to support us with it. For example, if sadness gets activated in my own system and my personality has developed the skills to process it effectively, like all of my emotions, the sadness activates the three things that I just talked about automatically. First, it lets me know that I've lost something that was important to me. Second, it activates behaviors that are intended to effectively process this sense of sadness. It might be that my body slumps, I become slow and lethargic so I can sit with the experience, and my thoughts revolve around the thing that I've lost in an attempt to understand exactly what's going on. Third, these behavioral responses, particularly my body language, sends out a signal to those around me that I am sad and I need support for this emotional experience. The intention of this behavioral response is to have the people around me pay attention by asking if I'm okay, to help me talk about the thing that I've lost, and to support me with processing the sadness that I'm experiencing. In other words, the emotion is telling me to connect with my support system in an effective and adaptive way so I can work through the emotion in a way that supports me with living the life I want to live and being the person I want to be. This whole process is intended to be exactly the same for the emotion of shame. So if we're looking at it from this perspective, What's the thing that shame is trying to tell us, and what is it that it's trying to communicate? Shame, like guilt, is tied to the understanding that we have for our true, authentic values and beliefs. But it's important that shame doesn't get confused with guilt, because there's a definite distinction between the two. When we look at it simplistically, guilt is tied to our actions and shame is tied to who we are. In other words, if I participate in an action that compromises this set of unique and intrinsic values and beliefs, then guilt is activated in my system, and it's actually meant to be there because it's completely justified. It is meant to get activated so it can let me know that I've compromised my values and beliefs and I need to stop participating in this particular behavior. Shame, on the other hand, is activated in our system to let us know when we are being a person that's not only compromising our values and beliefs, but also when we are being someone that, if other people find out about the things we're doing, we will be rejected by the community around us. Shame is about survival. It's about who we're being as a person, and if shame is justified, then it's meant to be there. We're supposed to be experiencing it, and it has a specific behaviour or action that's tied to it. I personally think Marshall Linehan sums this up very nicely.
So shame is an emotion, and you have to ask yourself whether it's justified or not. So the function evolutionarily for shame is that it gets you to keep your mouth shut and hide your behavior so you don't get kicked out of the community. So if you're going to get kicked out of the community if you tell them something, then shame's justified. And so the trick is to keep your mouth shut. If you're not going to be kicked out, then shame is not justified. So then you have to tell them everything to find out that you're not going to be rejected.
If we have an awareness that shame is what we're experiencing, one we've developed through our mindfulness practice, then the question becomes, is the shame justified? If it is, as Marshall Linehan just said, shut up and don't talk about it. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't ever talk about it at all. For example, for me, if guilt and shame are justified in my system, then first I have to stop doing the things that are tied to being this type of person. I have to stop taking the actions, but this only helps me to deal with the guilt. So the next thing I have to do is find a community of people that I can talk to about the thing I feel shame for. A community of people that won't reject me for what I've done. I do this so I can process what it means to me that I am actually being this type of person by talking about the things I'm doing with people who understand and therefore won't reject me. One of the problems with being a human is that we are meaning-making machines, and despite the common belief that we're reacting to the things that happen around us externally, the meaning that we're usually reacting to in actuality is being pushed on us from our own internal narrative. So if I'm behaving in a way that my own internal narrative makes me the type of person who's bad, who's evil, or who's defective at my core in some way, then clearly this means I'll be rejected and abandoned by my community if they recognize these things. More often than not though, this story isn't tied to what would happen in actuality. It simply isn't the case that I am this type of person, and it's definitely not the case that I'll be rejected or abandoned by my supports. The story I have in my system is driven by the activation of a maladaptive and ineffective schema, and as we talked about before, our schemas are tied to our childhood experiences, and if the schema we are responding to is one that's filled with stories of defectiveness or failure or social isolation, just to name a few, then the shame is not justified. And this is what is meant by our own story of toxic shame. It's being driven by our own internal critics. They're pushing this toxic narrative that has us trapped in old behaviors of isolation, avoidance, and those addictive, obsessive, and compulsive coping mechanisms that we're desperately trying to change. And this, quite simply put, is just not a healthy place for us to be. So in review, shame is a necessary and essential part of the human experience. When shame is justified, it's letting us know that we're being a person whose actions will be rejected by the community that we're connected to. When this is the case, we need to find a way to process the shame by first stopping the actions we're taking, and then finding a community to talk about the things we've done that won't reject us for doing them. Toxic shame is when the internal narrative, usually one that's coming from our own internal critics, is pushing a story on us that is simply not the case. Toxic shame is tied to the activation of the maladaptive and ineffective schema from our childhood and the rigidity of belief that's connected to this toxic internal state. Guys, I hope this video gave you a little bit of insight for what we mean when we reference toxic shame in the conversation conversations that we have. And if this discussion has piqued your interest and you want to know more, come join the live conversations that I facilitate each week for free on Zoom. I'll leave a link to the page containing more information about these groups in the description below. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon. Take care, be safe, and be well.